Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Wisor from the Center for the Study of Global Ethics at the University of Birmingham. I'm just going to jump right in. Apologies that I couldn't be there today. I'm sure it's an excellent event, and hopefully, technology permitting, I'll be able to answer some questions following the presentations. So Sharon left off finishing our description of the Phase 1 participatory research that occurred in 18 sites in 6 countries across Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. So at the end of Phase 1, we basically had the broad contours of what a gender-sensitive multidimensional poverty measure should look like. We knew that it should include multiple dimensions rather than simply being a monetary measure. We wanted it to be scalar, so participants clearly had the sense that there were a range of achievements within each candidate dimension that were relevant for assessing deprivation rather than simply binary indicators. Third, we knew that measurement insofar as possible should take account of the specific context in which deprivation occurs. And fourth, that it should be agent sensitive insofar as it could take account of the differential needs that people have through their life course. So we knew these sort of broad outlines of what we'd like the measure to be able to do, and the next step was to refine the list of dimensions that would be included in a multidimensional measure. So at the end of the first phase, participants had provided upwards of 30 or 40 candidate dimensions which could be included in a multidimensional measure, but that would be too many, because each dimension which is included diminishes the weight of all other dimensions. So we needed a method to reduce and refine the list of dimensions to be included in the final individual deprivation measure. So we asked participants to engage in a quantitative ranking of their priorities of given dimensions for determining whether an individual's life was free from poverty and hardship. So they would have 25 images in front of them that depicted various spheres of life in which deprivation could occur, and they were asked to place, this is the most important, this goes number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3, for determining whether a life was free from deprivation and related hardships. At the end of that exercise, we had aggregate rankings, and of course rankings broken down by country, field site, age, gender, and so on. And what we found were there's sort of 3 core groups of dimensions that were under consideration. So there was a first family where there was sort of wide agreement that these dimensions should be included. So it was food, water, shelter, healthcare, education, sanitation, cooking fuel, family relationships, which we were surprised by, adequate clothing, and electricity. And then there was a second family of dimensions in which there was less support, but still identified as rather important. So this was the environment, the ability to care for one's self in the sense of being clean and presentable in the community, the location of services, access to family planning, access to information and communication, freedom from violence, participation in community functions, voice in the community, access to free time, freedom of movement, property and inheritance rights, and access to assets and financial services. And that's in declining order of importance. And then there was a group of dimensions which people didn't really place much weight on, being free from disruptive behavior of others, having sexual autonomy, and having access to discretionary items. So you might think that from this list of dimensions, we could simply read off the top 15 and build a multidimensional measure of deprivation. But we didn't think that was adequate, and we thought that the richness of the first phase participatory research and the disagreements within various rankings in the second phase required some sort of more rigorous method to move from dimension rankings to the design of a multidimensional poverty measure. So there were several desiderata for including a dimension in the final individual deprivation measure. The first was that it had to be conceptually plausible, so it had to be the case that we could meaningfully say that this dimension was relevant for the measurement of poverty or deprivation. The second was that the dimension had to be of moral significance, so it wouldn't just be something that was important to people, but that sort of reflected fundamental human interests in the right kind of way. It had to be something which was easily and reliably measured. It had to be something which was suitable for institutional response. So as one example, a number of participants said having a strong relationship with God was a part of a life that was free from deprivation and hardship. But we don't think, or we didn't as a team, decide that it would be suitable for NGOs or governments to be in the business of strengthening people's relationships with God. So that's an example of a dimension which would be ruled out on this desiderata. It had to be a comprehensive measure with minimal overlap. So we wanted to make sure that all of the areas represented by individuals were present in the measure, and we didn't want overlap. So we didn't want two dimensions covering the same area of life. And finally, we wanted the tool to be useful in the sense that it would serve the purposes that are served by multidimensional measures of deprivation. So it could guide the allocation of scarce resources, it could evaluate public policies and institutional design, and so on. From that set of desiderata, we landed on the following 15 dimensions, and hopefully you have a handout available that covers all this. So first, food and nutrition; second, water; third, shelter; fourth, healthcare and health; fifth, education; sixth, energy and access to cooking fuel; seventh, sanitation; eighth, family relationships or interpersonal relationships; 9, clothing and personal care; 10, freedom from violence; 11, access to family planning; 12, freedom from environmental harm; 13, voice and participation in the community; 14, adequate time use; and 15, your status at work. We also, on a separate axis, collected information about people's financial status measured through a basic asset index. So almost everyone in the research agreed that money was important in some sense, insofar as it could secure all of these other things for you, but it's a sense of double counting if you include it in the multidimensional measure. So on a separate axis, we track a person's financial status as measured by the assets they possess. So then you have to select indicators for each of these dimensions. We use very standard desiderata for indicator selection. This comes from a wide range of literature on multidimensional poverty measurement and elsewhere. Indicators needed to be valid, reliable, specific, feasible, and comparable. And this is sort of more challenging and rigorous set of desiderata than you might think once you get into the business of figuring out how, with a paper form, in context of material and social deprivation, you're going to be able to track a person's achievements or deprivations in each of these 15 dimensions. And I should note that various indicators score sort of better or worse according to these desiderata. There's a final question in indicator selection, which is about the space in which evaluation should occur. So many of you will be familiar with the debate in philosophy and economics about what the proper metric of justice is. This is sometimes also known as the currency of justice. And often this debate is understood as between sort of utilitarians or subjectivists and resourcists and capabilities theorists. It turns out that these sort of categories don't map very well onto the candidate indicators which can be selected for measurement in each of the dimensions previously described. So we use this classification according to which there are 5 classes of indicators. You can measure the availability of a given resource. You can measure a person's access to a given resource. You can measure their use of a given resource. You can measure their achievement after the use of that resource. You can measure their subjective satisfaction with the role of that resource in their life. Or you can measure their subjective assessment of the importance of that resource in their life. So we ruled out both classes of subjective assessment on the grounds that the familiar problem of adaptation, two people with objectively equal lives in a given dimension might subjectively rate those differently, and this would be in part dependent upon the material and social circumstances in which they find themselves. We also ruled out availability as an appropriate space for measurement. So again, very familiar. There can be lots of food available in a given community, but if you can't afford to purchase it, then that's not meaningful for you. So all of our indicators come from the space of access to a resource, use of a resource, and an achievement. And in some cases, we'll have multiple indicators that come from separate spaces. So for example, in education, we want to measure use through enrollment, but we also want to measure achievement through literacy and numeracy tests. So many of you will be familiar with the large spike in primary enrollment over the past decade or two, and especially important increases in the number of girls who are enrolled in school. Unfortunately, this has in many cases not translated to educational achievements. So students are attending school but not learning very much or anything at all. And so we have indicators in these two spaces to try to take account of important achievements and deprivations in the dimension of education. So that's dimension and indicator selection. Now you need to score the indicators. As I mentioned previously, we object to binary indicators where you either are or are not deprived because they're insensitive to a range of information both below and above the threshold. We opted to use an interval scale in which a person is ranked from 1 to 5. So we have to convert categorical information about their status. So for example, the shelter they have onto a 1 to 5 scale, where 1 represents the most severe possible deprivation and 5 represents minimal adequacy. The reason that we stop at minimal adequacy and don't take advantage of deprivation sort of achievements above that threshold is we want to maintain what's known as the deprivation focus axiom in multidimensional poverty measurement, which states that a person's achievement above the level of deprivation ought not compensate for other deprivations below a threshold. So suppose that a person had really abundant leisure time and very little food, then they face a shock, they have even less food and even more leisure time. That increase in additional leisure time shouldn't compensate for the loss of food because they already had plenty of leisure time. So just to go through this 1 to 5 scale with you, you have, in the case of sanitation, at the score of 1, you have no access to any improved form of sanitation. At level 2, you have access to an unimproved pit, which is shared by the community. At level 3, you have access to an improved pit or latrine, which is shared by the community. At level 4, you have access to a flushing toilet that is shared or a private improved pit or latrine. And at level 5, you have a private flushing toilet. So of course, they're sort of above private flushing toilets. There can be greater achievements in the sanitation one has access to, but we treat that as minimal adequacy. All of this information then needs to be aggregated intrapersonally to calculate a final multidimensional poverty score for a particular individual. There's a large literature on how we ought to weight multidimensional poverty measures, and I believe it's really sort of an outstanding question what the best approach is. There's no magic in what we did in terms of weighting and hope that future research will address this question, but we wanted the weighting to reflect two things. First, that the worse off a person is, the more severe their deprivation is. So within each dimension, we applied a prioritarian weighting scale where being deprived at the level of 1 counts for more than being deprived at the level of 4. In other words, going from 1 to 2 is going to count for more than going from 4 to 5. We also had a dimensional weighting scale. So I mentioned earlier that some dimensions were viewed as much more important than other dimensions by participants. This also reflects an initially intuitively plausible thought, which is that a person who is deprived in food or shelter ought to be of greater moral concern than a person who's deprived of voice in their community or meaningful interpersonal relationships, even though we still think those latter things are of some importance. So all of that information is then aggregated to develop a final composite measure of a person's multidimensional deprivation. This is measured at the individual level. This is true even when some of the resources are household level resources, such as access to shelter. So that's the design of the measure. And I'll just note that we've had one nationally representative trial in the Philippines. This produced some meaningful and striking results. One thing of particular interest was that it turned out in the Philippines that women were not poorer than men, according to this multidimensional measure, and in fact, there were very few dimensions in which women were worse off than men. This was certainly striking for a project that set out to investigate a gender-sensitive poverty measure with the thought that we might find greater levels of female than male poverty. That said, the finding can be explained in certain ways. For one thing, the Philippines generally scores quite high on other measures of gender equity. It's also possible that because some of the indicators rely on self-response in the survey question, it's possible that some female respondents are sort of understating the level of deprivation they face. There are other possible explanations. But in any case, we're pretty skeptical of this sort of bumper sticker slogan that 70% of the world's poor are women, and we certainly think that the findings in the Philippines confirm that the feminization of poverty thesis isn't easily sort of proved there, and certainly we don't find evidence for it with our multidimensional measure. That's not to deny that there are very high levels of gender inequality both in the Philippines and elsewhere, but they're just not to be found in the space of poverty. So I'm happy to talk about that more during the Q&A session. I'm sort of running a bit short on time at this point. I'll just note a few other things. So future research, we hope to extend the individual deprivation measure to children. This requires a shift in both the dimensions in which you measure deprivation and the indicators which are used. We also hope to do further improvement on the weighting scheme and at least experiment with the possibility of participatory weights, whereby participants' responses on the importance of particular indicators or dimensions informs the aggregate weighting scheme. And we also hope to continue to refine the dimensions and indicators in which measurement occurs. We've just now completed, with the support of AUSAID and the Fiji Bureau of Statistics, a nationally representative survey in Fiji, so this should give us a lot more food for thought on the design of the measure and its ability to reveal deprivation in different contexts. And we hope to continue to expand into new countries and further contexts in the coming years. Again, many thanks for the opportunity, and I will look forward to the Q&A. Thanks.